This episode deals with abuse, sexual violence, victim blaming, suicide, suicidal ideation, depression, and more themes related to mental illness and trauma. Please feel free to listen to our other episodes and take care.
None of those ships are the ship for me with Elena. I don't think she's good with any of them. I think she needs to move away and just work on herself.
You're listening to Mystic Mondays, a supernatural-themed podcast hosted by fangirls Mika and Becca, who examine the best and the worst of beloved supernatural stories found in TV and film. Grab your steaks and your garlic because we're about to dive into Vampire Town.
Ooh. So it's no surprise by now that mental health representation is important to us. When looking at supernatural stories, trauma and terror is often expected, but a show like The Vampire Diaries, which is a really big show on the CW, could have approached trauma with more accuracy and more respect.
Vampires, they're sexy, right? These brooding, sometimes illustrious creatures have had a history of stealing our hearts, and we are fans of TVD. So we understand all too well their appeal. But when we examine these stories that intertwine immortals with very mortal themes, such as
mortality
and mental illness and trauma, are they as effective with how they've handled trauma? No. The answer is no.
No.
But let's first define trauma. So according to the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, trauma is a term used to describe the challenging emotional consequences that living through a distressing event can have for an individual. Traumatic events can be difficult to define because the same event may be more traumatic for some people than for others. However, traumatic events experienced early in life, such as abuse, neglect, and disrupted attachment, can often be devastating. Equally challenging can be later life experiences that are out of one's control, such as a serious accident, being the victim of violence, living through a natural disaster or war, or a sudden unexpected loss. As I was reading that definition, I was immediately like, yes, as we just stated in the intro, centuries of trauma. If you've been living through decades and decades of wars, etc., especially with the Salvatore brothers, because both of them participated in some sort of war in their lifetime. That's already like a check mark, if you will. So a traumatic event can be a recent single traumatic event, a single traumatic event that occurred in the past, or a long-term chronic pattern. Here is where we arrive at, well, what is trauma specifically other than what we just mentioned with the Salvatore brothers? First off, let's talk about how Caroline was abused literally by Damon and how the entire fandom seemed to, well, I don't want to generalize. I would say a good portion of the fandom pretty much forgave him off the bat. We've talked about this quite a bit, how the first few episodes of season 1, Vampire Diaries, is weird with Damon's characterization. He's a totally different person than he is in the second half of the season and then from then on. But recently I read an article even where Ian talked about how he wanted Damon to be this irredeemable villain like Kai was in season 6. And so you can already tell that that was the original intent. But I don't know, certain writers have shipper goggles even when they write episodes. So I guess that didn't happen. And the writers forgiving Damon through the plot and through other characters, we just kind of end up totally diminishing the fact that Caroline was abused by him. And she even brings it up and she calls him things like the literal devil, but it's all brought up later on in season 5 and season 6 as the joke.
Yeah, it's dismissed.
They're just sort of rivals, but why?
Oh yeah, because he took advantage of her multiple times and literally told her that she was nothing at some point.
God, he was so terrible to her.
Terrible.
Obviously, they started out the show wanting him to be
the bad guy, but a love interest.
Right? So he was going to be good, especially when they decided that he was going to be Endgame. Oh my God, Endgame. But like the way that they could have done that, even if he does abuse Caroline for the sake of the story or whatever the other things that he does in season 1, it's very much ignored as they go. They're like, oh, we're just going to pretend that didn't happen. As opposed to this happened and he's growing and this is how he's approaching what he used to be like. which would have
Yeah.
been better. And if they had actually had maybe Elena and Damon or something be more upfront about what he had done, then it would have hit harder. But anytime that it is addressed, it's very subtle. It's like you said, just a rivalry, and not like he actually manipulated her and hurt her.
And raped her.
Yeah.
It's just all brushed under the rug. And then later on, they are siblings-in-law. And even that gets like, oh, now they're family.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's this one scene, I think it's in season 4, the episode where the girls are all having their sleepover, and Damon and Elena have just gotten together, and now Caroline and Bonnie are not necessarily fans of Damon for obvious reasons. I remember that Caroline was the one who was trying really hard not to sound judgy, and then she ended up saying something that was harsh about Damon. I wouldn't even call it harsh because it's true.
Yeah.
But Elena took offense to it.
Of course she did.
The line that she gives is something like, "You jumped into bed with him as soon as you met him." And I'm like, no, she was raped.
Elena's such a...
Oh, yeah. That's a moment that continues to stand out to me, especially because the fandom and the plot really rewards Elena for behavior like that and punishes characters like Bonnie and Caroline who call her out on it. This is my Elena hate hour, apparently. I don't know, maybe they are perfect for each other, because Damon's approach to mental health has insert flashback to the Smallville episode where I briefly talk about the crazy counter. I constantly joke now that we're rewatching the Vampire Diaries as well. Like, we should have like a little counter at the bottom of every episode. How many times has a character been referred to as crazy? He says crazy all the time. Like, I wonder if he makes it through a single episode without calling somebody crazy or referring to their mental health. Yeah, because he's often calling people crazy pants, and it's stuff like that where I'm like, okay. He always uses it in a derogatory,
it's very demeaning
way. Yeah, as in, I'm going to put down your intellect for this, because it's often in regards to like a little shenanigan that they have planned, and then maybe somebody goes off track, and then he's like,
"Are you crazy?" Or like, "Okay, crazy pants." Just
constant,
which like doesn't hit, because a lot of these characters actually do have shit they need to work through.
Yeah. I mean, Bonnie, who we're gonna have a whole episode on, so I don't want to like dive too hard into that. She is so traumatized throughout the whole show. She's got a lot of loss and grief, and often she faces characters like Elena who give her ultimatums, like, you have to do this or this happens. She is often dealing with people who cross her boundaries all the time. Especially with her relationship with Elena. It's just not healthy, girl.
When we started rewatching it recently, in my memory, I didn't see it as that bad, I guess. But literally everything that she goes through happens off screen.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not even just the characters or the fandom that's not treating Bonnie well. And all of her stuff happens off screen, so it can't even be addressed.
Yeah.
And when she does have a moment where she's trying to be in her feelings and go through what she's going through, someone needs something of her. Elena always comes first.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very weird to me that they can write Bonnie the way that they do, which is to say fairly complex and well-rounded as an individual character, but then for the whole of it and like for other characters be really rough and not that good.
Yeah, she has to deal with all of her grief off screen. It's just
very... like, it gets you heated, right? I'm like,
it gets you heated. And these things have a real life effect or impact on people. You romanticize, like, that's the whole point of vampire romances now, is, and especially
the romance.
Yeah, and to be fair, even though the fandom did forgive Damon, they were also very impressionable. There was a good amount of them in high school, like myself.
Exactly.
It makes a difference, because then if you're like me and you live a sheltered adolescent life and then you venture off into the world of dating, you're not really sure, other than the stories that you've heard from your friends, but maybe your friends haven't dated either. So you turn to media that you like really enjoy, and you romanticize whatever you see. And so obviously it feeds into how you view the world. I would argue it does make a difference. We're not saying everybody should be like woobified and go to therapy and like there's no conflict, but the way that they handled it was irresponsible.
Yeah.
And it wasn't even in service to the story.
That's my thing,
It's
too.
not even good.
You can have really strong, shitty characters. It doesn't have to be anything grandiose either. You can just have a character that sucks. And it can serve, like, who's that guy that's in Good Girls?
Rio?
The really shitty guy. No, not Rio.
Not Rio.
The grocery store manager.
Oh, Leslie.
That guy is just a piece of shit, right?
Yeah.
But that's what he is, and it serves the story, and you know not to root for him. With Rio, however, because one of the characters has this thing with him, you're kind of like, do we want to watch him? Do we like him? Do we not? And it's okay to like that in fiction, I think. When it comes to Damon and to what you're saying about it being impressionable on teens, when the fandom as a whole forgives the character for what they're doing and or removes any problematic perception of them because they just want to like baby them, it creates that idea that what they're doing isn't wrong. So for characters like Damon, the fandom, the show moved on so quickly from what he did to Caroline. And in the show, it's not really addressed heavily. So if you're a teenager watching that, you might think, well, everybody loves Damon. Damon's a good character. He grows a lot. So what he did must not have been that bad.
Right.
You know? And of course, it's just a show. But the reason that we talk about these old shows is because they're what we grew up with. And we, with our mental illnesses, I would say, we have a little bit of experience and we can reflect. And when we watch it and we're watching it back for our nostalgia and just to have fun and enjoy something that we love, it's like, ooh, that doesn't feel good to see this go unaddressed by the writers and be really forgiven by the story and not even addressed.
You know, I did say BoJack Horseman earlier when we said shitty characters, but even in that show, they handle it so well.
They do.
Because they grapple with, well, how do you redeem a character that shitty?
It's part of the plot.
And it's very up in the air. And I feel like if they really wanted to see how that would come to fruition with Damon's redemption arc, then it should have been more nuanced. Even if they didn't explicitly talk about it, again, like, there are consequences for what we do, and sometimes shitty people get rewarded for shit that they shouldn't have been rewarded for in real life. But it felt like in the Vampire Diaries, it wasn't even that. No, you're just rewarded because you look
because
good.
You're the character you are.
Because Elena loves you. I don't know. I've been seeing a lot of discourse on Twitter too about fandom gets so puritanical now, and I'm like, I don't think that's what we're getting at.
If someone were to say you couldn't criticize Elena because then you're not enjoying the media, hello, did you watch the show? She's not a good character.
No, she's not. No.
Listen, if there is someone who really tries to dive into what makes Elena a decent person, as the show is so sure that she is, it's me. I've done too much of the diving in to try to make that a thing that exists. The issue is, it doesn't really. For every time that a character is like, Elena's really compassionate, or Elena's so kind, she's the nicest person, or Elena has all this love, like that's her big thing. For every time someone says that, Elena actually shows that maybe like a 12th of the time.
Right.
It's not as often as they're just telling us that. She's an important character to me, but I can't stand her, okay? But she is the main character. And so we have to talk about her and talk about her trauma as well when we're talking about how TVD handles trauma. All of her trauma, for the most part, is like completely unchecked. It's kind of like Bonnie, but in a different way, where it's all in your face, but nobody's addressing it. With them not acknowledging it beyond her being compassionate or feeling a lot, is that it doesn't actually address her root problems. They dismiss her as pretty emotional, especially when she turns into a vampire. They're like so scared of her turning everything off because she's a little impulsive. She's not going to be able to handle it. And for her as a character, you can see her being like, stop babying me, because she sees it and we see it and everybody coddles her, but the show doesn't back it up. So the writing doesn't back her up on that. She'll say it once and then agree with whoever is babying her and go with it. She doesn't stand up for herself well enough. So like, you have all of this trauma, but she never gets to confront it. It's definitely a plot direction you could go with, like a character direction you could go with, is her not being able to really dig deep. The problem is she never gets to. And all of her issues are resolved by everyone just coming to her rescue all the time without her even asking, or when she does ask. On top of that, she's very suicidal, and it's from the drop. It's constant. It doesn't really go away. And that tells me, much like the Damon thing, that they're not taking it as seriously as they should be. There's a comment, I think in season 4, where Damon dismisses her wanting to kill herself. And that's your love interest. That's the guy you want to date, and he's just like not worried about it.
Yeah.
Even though you've tried, it doesn't feel good to watch.
Love.
It's so gross to me. And, you know, you can ship it if you want to ship it. That's fine. I don't. It is not the ship for me. None of those ships are the ship for me with Elena. I don't think she's good with any of them. I think she needs to move away and just work on herself and not date these vampire boys who haven't even dealt with their own problems.
Yeah, let's talk. Okay, we've talked Damon. We haven't talked about Stefan yet, because Stefan's also the hero of the story. He deals with his trauma in a very specific way. But also, if you go to season 6, which honestly is my favorite season, in the first half of that season, he's pretty much avoiding everybody because he believes that Damon has died. I mean, Damon technically did die, but he was trapped with Bonnie. Now that's the ship. Anyways, he was avoiding everybody that he loved simply because he didn't want to deal with his emotions. And that's a huge thing with the vampires in this world, is that I was going to snap, but I can't snap, so I'll let Thanos do it for me. He can switch it off at a moment's notice. I've always seen it as a metaphor for self-medicating, going on a binge in a different way. Often for me, when I'm having a BPD moment, I do think of, like, damn it, I wish I could just turn it off like they do. It's going to be so easy. So numbing yourself out. And I don't think they really deal with that. His trauma about, I don't know, drowning in a box
for 3 months
in water. We don't really talk about that. He was also so tortured in the mind that he forgot everybody for a few weeks, I think. It's just one of those vampire things that you just brush off your shoulder.
When Lexi dies?
Yeah, when
and
Lexi died, and he was
like
sad for like maybe 2 seconds, and then it was like, okay, it's over now.
It makes me
I
so
was
mad.
real sad about that. And the thing is, if they did afford some time to diving into those emotions, the way that they sort of tried to do for Elena, I feel like it would only enhance the character more.
Yeah.
Because then it's like, you know what? Yeah, Stefan is this really tortured guy. It's not just that he's brooding in his little diaries. Like, hello, I want to see what's going on in his mind.
Stefan's therapy was like him seeing his best friend once a year, every year on his birthday. That was his therapy. Much. And even then, he never addressed it.
Again, I think of BoJack Horseman and how they handled trauma. And it was very real. Like, you talk about how Elena is described as someone who feels a lot. They could have dove deeper, but they didn't. And I'm not going to necessarily blame the writers for being ignorant, but I'm also going to blame a little bit for not doing the work if they're gonna dive into these issues. Like, they glamorized it.
Exactly. I feel like it would have benefited these characters because of the way that their being a hero is so set in stone, to have those things named. If we had something like that in TVD where it was like, Elena gets to go to therapy, someone tells her, hey, you've got this thing. I think for people watching it, especially right now, although I know it's not now, but, you know, just in general, it can really destigmatize those diagnoses because she's the hero and she's always going to be okay. So why not work with it?
Yeah.
Obviously, I'm not an expert in that, but I think that some shows have done that well. Never Have I Ever did that really well.
Yeah.
They did that really well, talking to her about what she's dealing with and her trauma. If we were to watch Legacies, would it be the same? I don't know, because I don't want to watch Legacies.
If you've been watching Legacies and you think it's worth giving time to, then please comment below so that
Did
we
they
can
do it
hear
any
you
better?
out.
Because
I've heard that they've done a good job, but I don't know about mental health specifically. And that's the thing too. You could argue that, oh, well, they're not that educated, but I'm like, educate yourself. It's that easy. Do a little bit of
Yeah.
a Google search.
Put
Google
that
search
effort
searched
into your
earlier.
show.
Yeah.
You know? Put
And
it
it
into
just-
your story.
It adds to the story. I mean, that's part of why I love Never Have I Ever so much.
They kind of treat it like, obviously you vent to your friends, but they really just unload onto each other, and then it's not really dealt with. If they're
there's
even
like
unloading.
zero healthy communication in there. I would probably be able to count maybe less than 5 instances on my fingers of how many times, oh, that was actually an okay interaction here. As my final point, I always really identified with Caroline because she always describes herself and other characters describe her as neurotic. And as a high schooler, I was like, well, what does that mean? I think I was in the 9th or 10th grade when I first started watching the show. And I would Google it and I'd be like, oh my gosh, that's me. I'm neurotic. But the way that they handled her arcs and Bonnie's were very flimsy. Sometimes it made me feel like, oh shit, is it a bad thing to feel a lot? Because all of these characters are being punished for feeling a lot.
Right, it's very
Again,
dismissed.
Real life impact.
Looking back at a show like this, it's not been on the air for a while, although the writers are still writing. Hello. Obviously, there's nothing we can do to change those shows now. They're out. They've been out. But like I said, it's a little bit about looking back at what shaped us and how it shaped us. Everything you learn and everything you are isn't the fault of fiction. But you do gain little things from it here and there. And if there's nothing combating it, then you're going to take it for face value. There's a lot of stuff that's like that. History books, film, and TV. When you have things that counter it and you have a diversity of media, you have the ability to think more critically about it. So like when we have more of these teen shows and more supernatural shows that are like, actually, this is how people can approach their trauma, or this is how these characters who maybe aren't accepted by one party can be accepted by another. And so you can get an understanding of that. It can help you shape your own view in real life.
Yeah.
Oh, my laptop's not plugged in. Let me plug it in real quick and then we can do our closing statement.
What was a moment that stood out to you guys, mental health wise? Comment below.
So yeah, we love the show. It's an
Yeah.
important part of our fandom history, but it definitely has its problems. And I think it's okay to enjoy stuff and still be like, actually, I
Wait
don't
a
like how they did
second.
this.
Yeah. It is important. Honestly, it's kind of fun and it gets you a lot more invested in the stories that you're engaging with.
If you loved the Vampire Diaries and you think that our opinions are ridiculous, that's fine. But if you agree with any of it or have more to say, we would love to hear it because we would totally be down for like any kind of discussion. And you can also talk to us on Twitter. I think we're most active on Twitter for any kind of conversations or retweets or whatever.
But you can also follow my Instagram and then I'll be more active. Thanks for tuning in about our talk about trauma. I promise that not all of our Mystic Mondays are going to be this heavy. They just happen to be this heavy for this month. So stick around.
Yeah. And obviously we like to talk about mental health on the show.
In case you missed it,
And
it's kind of our thing.
Mental health kind of goes hand in hand with a lot of horror and supernatural stories. So
it's on brand. And with that in mind, I hope you enjoyed this talk. I hope your week goes well because it's a Monday, assuming that you're listening to this when we release it. Stay witchy, and stay vampy and safe. Okay, bye.